the first question is one that we've talked about quite a bit over this last year and a half. Not necessarily directly related to how often we observe the Lord's Supper, but we've talked about the Lord's Supper quite a bit this last year. And so this question is, why do we observe the Lord's Supper every week? And so I appreciate the question. This has changed for us over the years here at the church. When I first came here 24 years ago, we were doing the Lord's Supper about once every quarter. And I say about because, when you do when I'm in charge of something that's that irregular, it's easy to forget. And so there would be a time or two that would be, oh yeah, it's been about 6 months since we've observed the Lord's Supper. So we would get after it and do it. And we would do it sometimes in a morning service and sometimes in an evening service. And so probably we're got to be close to a decade now of doing the Lord's Supper on a weekly basis. So it's not a new thing for us to do the Lord's Supper on a weekly basis. It's a newer thing of having wine in the communion service, but that's not the question. This question is, why do we observe the Lord's Supper every week? So the instruction is, this is the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth, where he says, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. So we have instruction about doing the Lord's Supper. We don't have a didactic study or teaching that says it must be done on the Lord's Day every week, or once every other week, or once a month, or once a quarter. We have this instruction, as often as you do it. So the instruction is that when you do it, you should do it in a worthily, that's the actual word that's used, a worthily manner. A manner that is done properly, which should include the entirety of the service. And so really this is a reforming work that we've been on for well over a decade of how we conduct the Lord's Supper. And we do it on a weekly basis. When we first started this, the questions were raised as, listen, if we do this every week, it'll lose its meaning. It'll lose its potency to us. It'll just become part of the service. And so my argument back to that is, well, let's just make sure we don't do that with the Lord's Supper. This is the Lord's Supper. It's not our supper. And so we must do all that we can, not to make it unique and genuine and especially special when we do it, but that whenever we do the routine of the Lord's Supper, we do it in a manner that is reflective of the grace of God, reflective of the value of the table and what it really is for us. So I have pastor friends who are all over the board on this. Some who do it once a month. Some do it once a quarter, like we have. Others do it on that kind of a routine, plus a handful of other special times throughout the year at special services. And I don't hold that we're doing it more perfectly than they are. I just hold that when we gather together, it makes sense that we would remember the Lord's death together. It also fits with a church history position. Not always. We can't find or at least I can't in my readings, that weekly has always been the case with the Lord's Supper. But I do think that certainly the value of doing it weekly, in the Reformed circles of life, this would be commonly referred to as the covenant renewal service, where we're renewing. We're not making our decision to follow Christ again, but we're renewing it. We're renewing the covenant. We're refreshing our mind. We're reviewing. We're speaking. We're telling. We're tasting. We're holding. All of these two religious symbols. We're interacting with God at His table, and that's actually quite beautiful. So we are instructed how to do this. We are also instructed how not to do this. But the actual frequency of it is, it makes sense to me that a weekly gathering of the saints on the Lord's Day ought to include the Lord's Supper. And so we do. I think I can build some biblical cases for it, but I don't think I can build the case to show my brother pastors that they're wrong to not do it on a weekly basis. Even though there are very few of my pastor friends who do it on a weekly basis, I do have some who do. And they have many of the same rationale and reasoning that we do. So we observe the Lord's Supper every week. I would say to anyone who's asking questions about the Lord's Supper, listen, if you're at a church that conducts the Lord's Supper on a monthly basis, then you ought to find out every one of those Lord's Supper services, and you shouldn't miss a one of them. Be there, participate in it, have your life in order, evaluate, examine your soul, and get right with God. Knowing that the supper itself doesn't save you, it doesn't keep you saved. These are all Roman Catholic teachings. But what this does do is it actually preaches the gospel every time God's people come to the table. If you're at a church that does it once a quarter, you ought to find out those 4 times every year that church does it, and you ought to be there, and you ought to participate in it. And I would say to those in our church, we do it 52 Sundays out of a year. You ought to do all you can. I'm making an argument you ought to be in church frequently. And I wouldn't suggest, if they're not doing the Lord's Supper on those other Sundays at other churches, that you shouldn't treat that service any less special. But I'm just saying, this really is something special that God has given to His people to participate in. And I think you ought to do all you can to be there and participate in it, whether it's more frequent than others. An argument might be, well, listen, 52 times is way too many times. Okay, well, then are 12 times too many? Because there's other churches that do it 4 times a year. So I would just say there, the Lord's Supper is special. And it loses its specialness when we don't treat it properly, worthily, as the Apostle Paul would give it.